This is episode 121 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi. I'm Stephen Roysowich, a retired psychiatrist and independent scholar in comparative literature, investigating the impact of the classics on Shakespeare. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this, the podcast that superbly applies Shakespeare's words to the internet. There's magic in the web. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
The extensive use of French is setting the scene, right? If we think about the way that plays were performed at the time in the Globe and other theatres, they didn't have extravagant sets. The only really extravagant thing about the kind of appearance of the acting would have been costumes, but everything else is pretty basic. So in some sense, the language has to do all the scene setting.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
One of the most romantic moments from Shakespeare's plays is when he writes Henry V, stumbling his way through a French declaration of love and wedding proposal to Catherine of Valois in Shakespeare's Henry V. It's a gorgeous scene and one of my personal favorites, but it presents a few questions since England was strongly pro-England at this point in history, even leaning anti-French at times, having taken measures like banning the import of French playing cards during Shakespeare's lifetime. So what was Shakespeare doing when he had one of England's biggest heroes speaking French on stage? Where did Shakespeare learn French in the first place? And does he get the language right? Here to help us explore the use of French in Shakespeare's plays, how the language fit into the life of William Shakespeare, as well as the French language history behind not only Henry V, but also the French that shows up in Hamlet as well, is our guest, Jennifer Nicholson. Jennifer Nicholson is a sessional academic in literary and interdisciplinary studies at the University of Sydney, teaching film, genre, and early modern literature. She researches from the early modern period into the 21st century with a focus on the various edges of the English language in a range of literary forms. Her projects currently span Shakespeare studies, particularly Hamlet, Montaigne, early modern drama, Renaissance books, world literature, untranslatability, and comparative translation. Primarily an early modernist, Jennifer's primary area of interest is currently the presence of French and French English in early modern English playtexts. She's currently working on a longer project concerning English language versions of film produced by Japanese animation company Studio Ghibli. Jennifer has work forthcoming and recently published in edited collections spanning from early modern drama to Anglophone translations of Japanese film. She tweets about her work, her cat, and other general interests at Just Generally, where generally is spelled, as you might expect, with a J. Find more information about Jennifer and her work in today's show notes. Hello, Jennifer. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Today, English is the international trade language that's often taught in multiple schools around the world as a part of a necessary education. But for the 16th century, Jennifer, what was the reigning international trade language? Was it French?
Well, it's kind of a good question. I think we could think of French as one of the international languages in Europe, at least. So if you spoke English, if you're from England and you wanted to go to the mainland, chances were you couldn't find many people who spoke English. It was considered a difficult language to learn and a kind of weird one off to the side. French was spoken quite widely, even in places that aren't now France. So that would have been a pretty good bet. But Italian would have been a pretty good choice as well to learn. Quite a few people spoke Dutch. So a few languages were sort of buzzing around as possible trade languages. French was, however, often the language being used in courts. So if you were an ambassador to another court, to a king or queen or to a lord, having some French was quite useful. And lots of royal and courtly households made sure that their children could speak both French and Italian because they were very useful languages for politics as well as trade.
Where did Shakespeare get the French that he used in his plays? Was he able to read French, or does your research suggest he was working from a translation when he came up with some of the French content we find in his plays?
It does somewhat depend on the play. In terms of the research that I was doing, I was focusing on Hamlet. And what I found most interesting was that some of the apparent references or ideas from texts in French seemed to arrive in a Shakespearean text before a translation was available. So either he had a friend who could read very good French and was helping him out, that is possible, or, other co-writers in some instances. But my research overall sort of suggests that he could read at least some French. And indeed, it was more likely that he could read French than speak French, I think, because there were quite a few texts circulating that were multilingual. It was quite easy to get a how to speak French kind of French for Dummies book quite cheaply, things like that. And they would give a guide, but the pronunciation was really the thing that unless you knew someone who spoke French, you'd be in a bit of trouble. That being said, there were plenty of people who could speak French in London at the time, and not all of them were, queens or lords and ladies. So there's a chance that he learned some French at some point, but it wasn't part of a kind of general education or curriculum. And we don't have sort of definitive evidence that he definitely spoke, perfect French.
Jennifer's research indicates Hamlet uses words that she classifies as, quote, French English, meaning she defines it as words that share a combination of pronunciation, spelling, and meaning, end quote. Jennifer, what are some of the French words you found appearing in 16th century English?
Well, there are some that we would just consider English words because of the kind of etymological background of English. We have kind of French/Latinate background of lots of words in English, and then we also have a kind of more Germanic side. So we get that the two sides of the language working together in what we now recognize as English. This was definitely still being worked out in the time that Shakespeare was around. So you have things like even the word silence written down is exactly the same as the word silence, right? So that's not particularly noteworthy on its own. But what is interesting is that you find, say, a phrase or an idea being expressed in but almost the same wording as it is in French. And it's almost as if it's just being kind of transliterated into English. What's unclear is whether it was in fact in French or in English. So a word like silence might well have been silence in some instances. And that's what's sort of unclear. A kind of key example of something that came up a few times would be born. So when we say born, we might say, a baby is born. And we might also say born as in he was carried. He was borne along by the tide, say, B-O-R-N-E. Then we also have the word born, which probably comes from kind of a Scottish kind of English, meaning kind of a bank or an edge of a river. But we have this French word born, which just means edge or limit. And there's a suggestion, and I didn't come up with this myself. This is Travis D. Williams in an article, I want to say about 10 years ago, for Notes and Queries, suggested that born meaning edge is the born that Shakespeare is trying to use in Hamlet's very famous to be or not to be speech. He says, you're talking about death, he says, the born from whence no traveller ever returned. And it's not particularly clear in that sentence what born means. The guess is, an edge or the place or something. But born in French is limit or edge or kind of terminus, some kind of ending that you can't get past or back from. So if we have the born meaning edge coming into English, it doesn't seem to be in English very often, i.e. there's only one finding, we've only found it once before that in a text meaning edge. And that born could well be from the Scottish born, because of what it's referring to. It's in a chronicle, the chronicle to do with English history. It's talking about edges and borders and all sorts of things. So there's a relatively high chance that the only other instance of born meaning edge written in an English text before Shakespeare's Hamlet is from a Scottish kind of dialect of English, but that this born may well have come from the French. His argument for that was actually based out of Montaigne's essays, who sort of talks about some similar ideas and uses a similar word. So that's where my kind of interest in Montaigne as a possible source from the actual French version rather than a translation. That's where that came from. But born's a good example of what is this language really? Is this a French word? Is this an English word? Well, my argument is it's a French-English word. It's kind of either or. You can't divide them easily.
Now, you mentioned earlier that how to speak French books were fairly common and cheap to acquire in Shakespeare's lifetime. Was there this huge market, or at least a substantial one, for French texts in 16th century England?
Yes, absolutely. So I had a pretty thorough trawl back through some of the kind of printing history, and there is a lot of both French language kind of learning books. So things like what I like to call the French for Dummies books, a lot of that kind of thing. And then also just plenty of text published in French. So you have original French texts, so something like Calvin's various religious tracts that he's writing originally in France, so the Reformation era kind of stuff happening on the mainland. That just gets published again in French in London at the time. There are also translations available. You can read it in English, but there are plenty of copies being printed in French. And there are lots of other texts, both translations from other languages into French, which I find really interesting because it means that there's a specifically French market for texts in other languages to be put into French, not just a market for, the original French of something. So, the market for French texts is obviously, to an extent, would be for French people in London, and there were plenty of them. There's sort of a few waves of migration of French people coming into England for various reasons. So to an extent, that would have been, marketing, for the want of a better word, to French people, French background speakers. But there seems to have also been plenty of interest in and at least basic understanding of French.
As Jennifer's research points out, Ben Jonson wrote a memorable description of Shakespeare, saying that he, quote, had small Latin and less Greek, end quote. Scholars often cite this reference as proof that Shakespeare did not use many languages beyond English. Jennifer, does your research support the conclusion that Shakespeare spoke only one language?
No, it doesn't. And I think any scholar that is doing extensive research into whether Shakespeare spoke more than English would very quickly find that he definitely had very good facility in Latin. This is not surprising at all. While we don't have official school records for him, it's extremely likely that he went to what was called grammar school. So boys aged about 8 to 14 or 15 went to sort of an equivalent of today's sort of middle school or, middle high school. And what they mainly learned was Latin. So they learned how to argue and how to kind of philosophize, I suppose, but in and out of Latin. So using English as the kind of way to get in and out of Latin. So really understanding how the language worked, things like that. That was really important to kind of how education worked at the time. He almost definitely knew Latin very well. Jonson's comment there then makes it sound like, oh, well, maybe he didn't know any Latin. He says, small Latin. But what's key is that Shakespeare didn't go to university. Many other playwrights at the time did. So Shakespeare is almost kind of separate from a lot of the other major playwrights of his era in not being a university-educated person. If you went to university after grammar school, you would have done more Latin, so you would have been much more up to speed on the kind of complex additional grammatical stuff, as well as, other key texts, other key authors, things like that. And also you often learnt Greek. So having small Latin and less Greek is actually really an indication of the fact that Shakespeare didn't go to university, not an indication that he didn't speak anything outside of English.
So he's making fun of him for not going to college, not really speaking about his language skills.
Absolutely. And I think also, and this is a little bit of somewhat intelligent, but somewhat just a guess. I think part of the teasing is that Shakespeare's texts are full of references to lots and lots and lots of different Latin texts. Anyone who was worth their salt would have recognized all these different references. So I think poking fun at, he didn't even go to college is even funnier when you consider just how much he referred to other texts. They were both school texts and non-school texts. So he was definitely competent enough to go read Latin stuff on his own and definitely interested in doing that and adapting them and putting references to them in and out of all the different texts and poems that he wrote.
Henry V is the obvious choice when examining Shakespeare's understanding of French, since this play, while not the only one to feature French language, does contain entire scenes conducted in French. Students of French will notice that many of the French phrases in that play, however, are considered incorrect by today's standards. Jennifer, are the phrases in Shakespeare's Henry V considered incorrect by 16th century standards?
Sort of yes and sort of no. If we're talking about spelling, yes. The reason that certainly the original text that's, written into the script is spelt very strangely often is usually put down to the fact that probably the actors didn't speak French. So if Shakespeare is giving them their part to learn, chances are there's some kind of phonetic guide going on. This is roughly what the French phrases are supposed to sound like. So just memorize these, and then people will understand what you're saying. So that's some of the kind of reasoning behind possibly the really odd spelling. Also, spelling is extremely flexible at this time, both in French and in English. Certainly by the very soon after Shakespeare's life, I think it's the 1630s or so, French, the Académie Française starts to really codify French spelling and grammar as a kind of system. So that's obviously starting to move towards that before that decade. Certainly English spelling is extremely creative at that point in time, and the grammar of both are a bit more flexible. So what you do find is that some of the French phrases, yes, in modern French would be incorrect. An adjective's in the wrong place, or the verb and the noun just don't match, things like that. But that stuff was really not as strictly codified or followed, both in France and elsewhere. So there is a chance that it's just a bit more flexible, and Shakespeare is taking advantage of that. Maybe he doesn't fully understand all the grammatical rules either, right? So he might have pretty good French, but just not quite understand it. I mean, I would say in some senses, that's my French knowledge too. So you might have a general idea of how it works, but when you actually go to write it or speak it, you don't necessarily get it right all the time. And if you're the only French speaker, no one's going to pick up on that when you write the script, right?
Well, sure. I mean, I'm a native English speaker, and I don't even understand all of the grammatical rules of English either. So you can have quite a bit of knowledge about a language and not know everything about the grammar.
Exactly. And if you're already working with English, a language where grammar is very, very flexible, particularly at that time, and then you're working with another language that's, also a bit stretchy, you might end up with a quite creative interpretation of what French is. What is interesting to me, though, in Henry V is that because there are whole scenes in French, not just a phrase or two, it suggests more than just a very basic facility, right? The main scene that I think of when I think of French scenes in Henry V, I think of the fantastic scene between Catherine and Alice, where Alice teaches Kate all the different the English equivalents for French parts of the body. And what it actually is her saying, oh, hands and neck and, things like this. But what actually happens is as she says each of the English terms, she says them in such an exaggerated French accent that what she actually starts saying is, progressively more expletive French words instead.
I know.
She starts swearing, right? And it's very funny.
It's hilarious.
If you don't speak French, the scene makes absolutely no sense.
That's true. That's true.
So enough of the audience have to understand French. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother with scene after scene of this kind of comedy, right?
Wouldn't be worth putting it in there. So it's
not worth it. You might have a line of it, right? Because you will always have in any given multicultural, multilingual audience, you'll have a handful of people that understand a language like French in that time period. Some might say, oh, well, some of the royal family or some of the court might have come to some performances. So that's why they're in there. Sure. But a whole scene of just swearing, that sounds like it's for the common people, not for the queen.
That's intentional. Yeah. I wouldn't take my swear words in to meet with the queen. That doesn't sound good.
Not necessarily, no, exactly. So.
Considering one of the main battles for Henry V, the man, is Agincourt, though, where the actual historical Henry V makes this claim to rule France. Was Shakespeare simply being a good playwright to include all of this language that was historically accurate to his subject matter? Is he using French because this is a French play? Or is the use of French some kind of political statement?
I think it's probably a little bit of all of them, in that I think to an extent, the extensive use of French is setting the scene, right? If we think about the way that plays were performed at the time in the Globe and other theatres, they didn't have extravagant sets. The only really extravagant thing about the kind of appearance of the acting would have been costumes. But everything else is pretty basic. So in some sense, the language has to do all the scene setting. So what's the easiest way to say we're in France? Have some people speak French. So even if you don't speak French, if you're in that audience and you hear people say, bonjour, bonjour, you're like, oh, they're in France, right? So you get a lot of the scene setting already. So I do think to an extent, it's kind of a historical accuracy or, event accuracy for the purposes of setting the scene, right? This is the kind of story I'm telling you. This is where it's happening. This is who's there. I'm going to use that language as part of that setting. So I think there's that happening. I think it's a political statement because, Queen Elizabeth is on the throne because of the kind of history that's led back to Henry V. Part of it is establishing her as the rightful ruler always. In fact, all of the any vaguely political text to do with any sort of royal history would have been very carefully read by by the
Master of the
Revels or something.
Master of the Revels, yeah.
Yeah, Master of Revels. So he would have checked, is this acceptable, or do we need to take some bits out? Do we need to censor something? I had a colleague who wrote a whole dissertation on censorship in the early modern period. There's lots of really careful checking of that kind of thing. So to an extent, it's doing the right things and saying the right things about the right people so that we all, comfortably in the audience understand, yes, our queen should be on the throne, and yes, England's doing the right thing. And it's, in that sense, a bit of kind of nationalistic guff, right? But, I think it's doing both of those things. And also, interestingly, Shakespeare's likely to be writing all of his history plays with reference to Holinshed's Chronicles, which have a kind of general record. And they're already quite political. They're already quite like, yes, England did this and England did that, and this is why we are who we are. There's a bit of that tone already. So in some sense, he's probably responding to the tone of that and kind of maybe extrapolating that out a little. It's the same reason that some of the French characters are stereotypically meant to be stupid or meant to be confused, because it's meant to make the English characters look better. It's just a, gross generalization for the purposes of theatre. It's not necessarily politically correct in today's terms.
Quite often when scholars examine Shakespeare's Hamlet, one of the biggest obstacles is the fact that the three surviving texts of Hamlet all have glaring differences between them textually. So since we're looking at the impact of what the actual words were, Jennifer, when you approached Hamlet to examine the French-English relationship linguistically, how did the differences in the three texts impact your research?
Well, there are kind of two ways that it was both, I suppose, exciting and very difficult. First thing to clarify for listeners would be that while there are three Hamlet texts, two of them are relatively similar. If you go into a bookstore or you're at college or at high school and you get told, you're reading Hamlet this term, and you go and buy a copy, chances are it will be a version of or a combination of what's called the second quarto version or the folio version. Both of these are the version that tend to be put on in productions, or to be honest, often a combination of the two. Often people kind of cherry pick the little scenes or particular lines or phrases or ways of doing things from either text, and they kind of make their own version. The kinds of differences in those two texts, yes, there are differences, but they don't make really big changes to characterization or the overall narrative, things like that. So the kinds of differences are, a speech is one line longer or shorter, or two relatively minor characters might swap lines. So Marcellus and then Barnardo might speak in the opening scene one time, and then the next time it's Barnardo followed by Marcellus in the other version, things like that. So those kinds of differences to an extent may well be printing errors, may well be transcription errors, might be things like, they did a version where they had this speech and they did a version where they did this speech and they happen to have a printed version of each. If you speak to contemporary playwrights and directors and things like that, these kinds of little changes happen quite often with any kind of play. So to an extent, those two versions, yes, there are little differences, but I wasn't so confused by those so much as just kind of interested in what those differences are. The first quarto, however, that's a different beast entirely. For a long time, historically, we didn't have a copy of this. We didn't know it existed. Scholars found it in the early 1800s and sort of thought, this must be a pirated copy. It's so bad. They called it the bad quarto because they thought it was kind of low quality. They thought someone had possibly gone to a printer and, they'd memorized the whole play. Maybe they'd been in a version of it and they'd memorized it. And so, gone to a printer to try to make some extra money. The sort of famous instance of what is often known as bad quarto writing would be, to be or not to be, we expect, that is the question, we get, there's the point. And from there, the whole speech sounds really kind of a little bit clunky, it's much shorter, it's much simpler often. Sometimes the syntax is really confused, so you can't work out what the sentence is actually about. It feels like there's a section missing or a noun is not there or something like that. So the first quarto is quite strange by comparison. I didn't know much about it before I started the project that I was working on at the time. So first of all, I was just interested that it existed. Second of all, I couldn't work out whether both from other scholarship and my own investigations, what kind of relationship it actually had to the other two versions. Were the two versions, as the argument sometimes goes, the two other versions, whichever version was first, exist, and then someone does a pirated copy of the first quarto sometime later. Okay, perhaps. But then when you look at the printing history, the first quarto is the earliest printed copy. So that seems a bit strange. Then you look at the front page of the second quarto, which is only published 1 year after the first quarto. And it has a note, expanded, the true and perfect copy. So then people said, oh, well, maybe the second quarto is like a reaction print against the first quarto because the first quarto is a pirate. So then the second quarto gets printed. No, this is the real version. You need to buy this one. That one's the dodgy version. This is the good one. But then when you actually sit down, you look outside of some of the really key speeches, things like To Be or Not to Be that we think of as, that's beautiful Shakespearean writing. When you take some of those scenes out and you look at other sections, they're actually really similar. So a lot of the in-between scenes, very similar. It's often a key speech or a key character kind of moment of some kind that seem to be different. So while the language is a lot simpler in some instances and a bit more convoluted in some instances, I sort of thought, well, this doesn't actually seem kind of thematically speaking significantly different to the other two versions. And I wondered, okay, so how did this end up on stage? There are references to a Hamlet being performed as early as 1584. The first printed copy is in 1603. That's the first quarto. Second quarto is 1604. Folio is until 1623. So we can worry about that. That's a little bit later. But 1603 is first quarto. 1604 and 5, there are editions of the second quarto being published. But I don't think any scholar is in doubt of a Hamlet being on stage by at least 1600. That is Shakespeare's version. The 1584 version has often been thought of as somebody else's play. Someone else must have written a Hamlet. Now, this did happen, right? People would occasionally write a play and then Shakespeare would be like, no, I'm going to do that, actually. And then he would write a different version of it. He's not the only one. Other people did that. Then people wrote the same stories again and again. So there's 2 Troilus and Cressidas. There's 2 King Lears by different people, right? We don't have copies of all of them, but we have different versions. So this really early Hamlet, 1584, is often thought of as somebody else's. And I looked at all these timelines crossing over crazy, and I just thought, what if they're all the same text? Like, what if Hamlet is just Shakespeare's Hamlet the whole time? Like, do we have to have another text in there? Is that a really logical historical explanation? Or are we just doing that because we think of Shakespeare already as this really brilliant English author? And so, we can't accept the fact that he might have written something not very good, right? If we look at his lifetime, 1584 is early adulthood. Maybe he wrote some stuff that wasn't as good early on. It makes sense that an author would develop a style. It makes sense that an author would gradually, come into his own voice, come into a better style perhaps. So that was kind of my hypothesis. And then I set about thinking about how he might have gotten there. And one way is by actually reading the French narrative source for a Danish prince called Hamlet who kills his uncle.
Susanna, Shakespeare was only 1 year old in 1584, so I'd like to think as a fellow parent, he was bleary-eyed from nights of no sleep when he wrote that one, if he wrote the first one. That's just...
Very possibly.
Possibly. It's a fun theory to throw out there just for the sake of conversation.
I like it.
One of the very specific French phrases that Jennifer talks about in her research was one that, Jennifer, I don't actually know how to say this. And I speak French and I don't know how to pronounce this. I want to say capapi, but I've never heard it before. What is this phrase and what did exploring it in context of the play teach you about Shakespeare?
Right. So the phrase, I'm actually not sure how to say it either. So you're not alone there. I had a sort of a bit of a trawl through printed text from around the same time to see if I could work out, is there a consistent way to spell it? No, there isn't. So the cap is basically always C-A-P. The A is normally A. Occasionally it's E. But the P part is P, P-E-A, P, P-E-E. It's also kappa pi, P-I-E. It's sometimes kappa pay, as in just PE, or PE with an acute on it. I first noticed this actually when I read Hamlet first in high school. I noticed it and thought, oh, kappa P. And the version that I was reading was written kappa pi. So it was cap hyphen A hyphen P-I-E. And I was like, oh, I reckon that's kappa pied, like head to foot in French. So I looked it up, and that's what it is. That's what it means. It means head to foot, or, top to toe, head to tail, that kind of expression. Cap is top or head. Pied is foot. And I thought, that's odd. Why is there sort of like a bad French phrase in the middle of this English speech? Like, that seems weird. And then I sort of just stopped thinking about it for, half a decade. And then I looked into it some more when I was doing this project, and I realized that this is a really common phrase in English texts at the time. So they're not French phrase. It's not a French phrase in its own right. It's within otherwise English language texts. And I thought, that's interesting. And then I thought, well, okay, given that there's a long history of, Norman, Anglo-Norman interacting, invading each other, all these kinds of things, there's a lot of leftover French in English at that time period even that actually filters out by the time we get to contemporary English, the English we speak now. But we still have phrases in English that came from way before Shakespeare. So something like, they finished the race tête-à-tête, head to head. So we still have things. We still have RSVP. I don't know how early that is, but, répondez s'il vous plaît. It just means, please let me know if you're going to be there. But we don't say that. We say RSVP still. So that's interesting. So kappa pi or kappa pie or kappa p or whatever we want to say, it seems to be kind of like that. But there isn't an exact equivalent in French at the time. What there is the grammatically inverted version, de pied en cap, from the feet to the head, right?
That sounds like the same thing to me.
Yeah. So I thought, okay, so is that just like the French grammatical version of the thing in English? That seems weird. And then I thought, maybe head to toe isn't an expression in English yet. Maybe that it becomes head to toe in English eventually. Looked into that. Nope, that's way back in English from at least the year 900. So it's not that. Shakespeare could have used head to foot or head to toe or top to tail. The rhythm of it is the same. The syllables of it is the same. So it's not like he's choosing kappa pi or kappa pie to fit the meter of his line, which is, again, that could work. No, it just seems to be in there like it's a perfectly understandable thing. It's also not explained anywhere in the speech. So sometimes Shakespeare uses a word that either is uncommon, is something like a French word or an Italian word. There are sometimes jokes about Latin where there's something in Latin and then the following line will explain what it means. And same with English words too. So even the famous one, Scott Newstock gives an example of Macbeth saying, making the multitudinous seas incarnadine, which sounds, just nonsensical unless you know what it means. But the following line is making the green one red. So incarnadine means making red, because the line immediately following it sort of glosses it for you. So this is a really common technique that Shakespeare uses when he's using a word that might not be familiar to his audience. He doesn't do that for kappa p. So that suggests to me, okay, that's a known word. That's a known phrase. Interesting, because that's not strictly French. It's not being used in French texts, but it's 3 French words put together to be a word that's perfectly understandable in English. That seems really strange to me. So that was a really kind of important finding for me. Really interesting too, he uses head to toe in English at a different point in the play too. So it's not like he doesn't know that that's in English either. Very strange.
It is strange. It makes me think a whole lot of questions that I'm not going to put here because I'm going to go on to the next one. But yeah, you've got me thinking all kinds of things. Several of the French phrases Shakespeare uses in his plays have perfectly functional English equivalents, even phrases that existed not only in the lexicon Shakespeare was using at the time he was living there in London, but even way back into Old English, like some of the phrases you just mentioned, like head to toe. Jennifer, why is Shakespeare choosing to use French words specifically instead of just writing the English version?
I think in some instances, it seems to have been a common choice. Right, so he's not the only person doing this. There are more what we would look at just as French words, but they might have thought of as English words, more French words kind of scattered through what we recognize to be English. That's partially because of the history of the development of the language. So even now, if you sit down with a Shakespearean speech or poem and you're a native English speaker, chances are there are words in there that you just don't understand unless you look them up. And often they are words with a French background. Not always, but often. So in some senses, he's probably using more kinds of English, which we might think of as French English, because that was in use at the time. So it might have fallen out of use by the time we get to today's English. I also think, though, and this was, a lot of the focus of my work, I think that often when I was finding these French phrases or words that could be French versions of the same word, what seemed to be happening is he was referring to another text that was written in French. And so if he could keep some of the French words when he wrote his English speech or poem or play, he would. And that might have just been because he could, might have been because he thought it was interesting, it was a bit different. He was certainly interested in how words worked, how they sounded alongside other words. So sometimes he might choose something like kappa P because of the other consonants in the speech, right? He might have wanted to get a bit of an effect. It might have helped the actors know their lines, right? So this is something often happens. You get speeches with particular repeated sounds or ideas or patterns, and that's to kind of help the mnemonic memory as well. So there's all sorts of reasons that it might happen, but they are interesting to think about.
Well, I know we would love to explore this topic further. This is fascinating, all of the French and the history of languages. What are some of your books or favorite resources you could recommend that we use to explore this topic further?
There are so many. One of the key things that I found, which, helped me to start off on this kind of investigation, was that little article in Notes and Queries by Travis D. Williams, which is on the word born in Montaigne and Hamlet. But one really interesting one for those who might speak some French or can read some is, anything by, but particularly this article, Jean-Michel Deprat, who wrote an article for the French Shakespeare Society in 2000. It's called I Cannot Speak Your England sur quelques problèmes de traduction de Henri V. So on the several problems with the translation of Henry V. And he works on translation. He's written quite a lot on how difficult it is to translate Henry V into French, because what do you do with the French scenes, right? So it's a really fascinating article about some of the challenges, and actually he's written quite a lot on that. So people who might be interested in that side of things, anything by Deprat is probably a good place to go. But some others in English, Terry Boris, again for the same journal, a couple of years ago wrote an article, Enter Shakespeare's Young Hamlet, 1589. And she doesn't make quite the same argument as me, but she makes some similar suggestions about how we understand the early history of enacted Hamlet in relation to how young Hamlet actually is as a character, in addition to which text might go first and why. So that's an interesting one for that kind of thing. And then the other three that might give a bit more kind of context around what I was doing and spark some interest. William M. Hamlin wrote a monograph a few years ago, Montaigne's English Journey, reading the essays in Shakespeare's day. And he actually looks at the way that the translations of Montaigne kind of circulated in England and what kinds of impacts they had. So John Florio, key translator of the time, did a translation of Montaigne's essays published in 1603. And actually, I believe earlier in 2020, there was an episode on That Shakespeare Life focusing on John Florio. So if you're interested in that, you can go listen to that one because that's who he is.
Oh, thank you for that.
He did a translation of Montaigne's essays, which is sort of simultaneously fantastic and really terrible. It was very popular. And so Hamlin's book is interested in that kind of history, how Montaigne travelled around England as in the texts of Montaigne, how they travelled. Marjorie Rubright has a fantastic chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Shakespeare and Embodiment, which is on the myth of monolingualism in Henry V. Again, even early, first question of this podcast, we were talking about, if English is the international trade language now, what was the international trade language then? We often, in the English-speaking world in particular, tend to think very monolingually. Unless you have a background where you speak another language, you often will assume monolingualism. But that's a very contemporary assumption to make. And so Rubright talks about, this kind of taking out that myth of monolingualism. How should we read the French and English in Henry V? And finally, really, really fantastic and interesting, more about the kind of interest in French in English texts. Deanne Williams, The French Fetish, From Chaucer to Shakespeare. What a fantastic title. Sort of talked about the interests in learning French, speaking French, the influence of French text and culture and language. That's a really fantastic one to check out as well.
Those are excellent resources. Absolutely. We will link to all of these as well as the episode on John Florio in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you check out those to find all of these great resources. Jennifer, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
This is a tricky one because a favorite book is always difficult. And you need to pick a book that you want to read again and again and again, because you only get that one book aside from the Bible and Shakespeare, right? One, I think the choice, and this is strangely on brand for my interest in French, that wasn't intentional, is I would take a French copy of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince, as you might know it.
Oh, I love that book.
I think that's a beautiful book. I read it as a child. I reckon I read it once a year now, in English usually. But I have, struggled my way through the French copy once or twice, and it's really rewarding. So I'd take a French copy with me, and then I would work really, really hard on my translation skills on the island by myself.
Well, you would be well set up there on your deserted island, for sure, with that choice. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm excited about turning this project into a monograph. I'm in correspondence with an editing team, and I'm working on a kind of full proposal for that. So hopefully some version of this will be out there. Yes. Whenever that happens, it'll be a little while, I think, but working on that. And I've got some other work, again, on French English, but in Marlowe's plays. He actually spent some time. So Christopher Marlowe, playwright, same year as Shakespeare, born the same year, died very early, bit of a swashbuckler, fantastic playwright if you want some other early modern text to read. Interested in his use of French. He definitely spoke French. He spent some time in France. So he's kind of different case study to think about French English and French in early modern plays. So I'm doing a bit of work on that. And I've also got some very early work starting on kind of more broadly on hearts, as in your source of life, the thing that pumps blood around your body, and hearts as in H-A-R-T, the deer that you hunt. I'm interested in kind of like what it is to think about desire and hunting and knowledge and all sorts of exciting puns on the word heart and heart. And we'll see where that goes. But that's the next big project on the horizon.
Exciting stuff coming from Jennifer Nicholson. We'll be sure to stay in touch and follow your work as you move forward. Thank you so much for being here and exploring the world of French English and French language in Shakespeare's plays. This has been fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
To find examples of French text in Shakespeare's plays, including information on Henry V, Catherine of Valois, and Hamlet, as well as more information on Jennifer and her links to those recommended resources that she gave us in today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes for today's episode. Find all these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 121. That's CassidyCash.com/EP121. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right! That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.